In the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, believed they held not just the advantage, but the mandate of destiny. After 6 months of unparalleled triumph, the obliteration of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, the seizure of vital resources across Southeast Asia, the humiliating surrender of Singapore, the Pacific was a Japanese lake. This initial overwhelming success had a corrosive side effect: arrogance. The architects of this blitzkrieg, particularly the planners within the Naval General Staff, clung to an idea rooted in decades of militaristic doctrine, that the war would be decided by a single, crushing, decisive battle, Kantai Kessen. The enemy, the Americans, were viewed through a lens of profound cultural contempt. They were seen as soft, materially obsessed, individualistic, and lacking the spiritual discipline and collective will of a nation fighting for its emperor. This perception, fostered by intelligence reports and ideological bias, fundamentally flawed every strategic calculation made in Tokyo. The belief was simple: a wounded America would quickly lose its resolve, and a second crippling defeat would force them to sue for peace, allowing Japan to keep its vast, newly conquered empire. The man who carried this flawed victory on his shoulders, Admiral Yamamoto, was the only one who truly understood the depth of the challenge. Having served as a naval attaché in Washington and having studied at Harvard, he famously warned his peers, "I can run wild for 6 months, but after that, I have absolutely no expectation of success." He knew the limitless industrial capacity of the United States. He knew the potential fury of a nation angered. Yet even Yamamoto felt compelled to press the issue. He saw Midway Atoll, a tiny refueling base, the last sentinel before Hawaii, as the perfect lure to destroy the remaining American carriers and end the war before America's industrial juggernaut could fully awaken. His plan was brilliant, complex, and fatally overconfident, a massive 4-pronged assault intended to overwhelm and ambush the entire American fleet. But as the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed toward their intended triumph, a silent, equally crucial battle was being waged in a dim, damp subterranean chamber deep beneath the shattered remnants of Pearl Harbor. This was Station Hypo, cryptology's front line, manned by a small, eccentric, and utterly exhausted team of codebreakers. Their commander was Joseph J. Rochefort, a man of brilliant intuition whose daily uniform consisted of a smoking jacket and slippers, often sustained for 20-hour shifts by sheer willpower and endless cups of lukewarm coffee. Rochefort's team was wrestling with the Japanese Operational Naval Code, JN-25B. This was no simple substitution cipher. It was a layered fortress of complexity, involving vast codebooks, additive tables, and changing keys, a linguistic and mathematical wall designed to be impenetrable. Yet piece by agonizing piece, through painstaking labor and pattern recognition, they began to see fissures in the wall. By late May 1942, Hypo had deduced the enemy's aggressive intent, the sheer size of the attacking force, the 4 main carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, and the window of attack. The one missing critical piece was the target. The Japanese communications referred to the objective only by the cipher AF. The intelligence staff in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles from the frontline traffic, strongly argued that AF referred to bases in the Aleutian Islands, a plausible distraction tactic. But Rochefort, living and breathing the Japanese radio chatter, was adamantly certain the flow and rhythm of the communications pointed only one direction: Midway. The conflict was existential. A misread target meant sending the depleted American carrier fleet, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily recalled Yorktown, into an empty ocean, allowing the Japanese to seize Midway unmolested. Rochefort knew he needed undeniable proof that could silence the skeptics in Washington. He devised a classic textbook example of cryptographic deception. Working with the commander at Midway Atoll, he transmitted a coded message that would be easily intercepted but crucially delivered in a low-security cipher. Midway was to report that its newly installed water distillation plant had broken down and that the garrison was desperately short of fresh water. The bait was set. Within hours, the Japanese dutifully intercepted the message. Soon after, Rochefort's team, straining over their decryption tables, intercepted an operational message transmitted by the Japanese Naval Command. The decoded message, the final confirmation of Nimitz's trust and Rochefort's genius, simply read, "AF is short of water." The strategic ambiguity was instantly resolved. Midway was AF. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz could discard the cautious plans based on speculation and execute a risky, brilliant counterambush. The Japanese admirals had misjudged the Americans, not in valor, but in intellect. They believed their codes were unbreakable, and in that fatal security failure, they handed the American Navy the precise time and location of their own inevitable destruction.
The confirmation was instantaneous. AF is short of water. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, now held the precise time and location of the Imperial Japanese Navy's attack. But information alone could not win the battle. Nimitz faced a brutal, almost insurmountable reality. The Japanese were mobilizing an armada of 160 ships centered around 4 heavy aircraft carriers, the Akami, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the elite of the Kido Butai, mobile force. The Americans, by contrast, could muster just 2 functional carriers, the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. The ratio was 2 to 4, a deficit compounded by the fact that the Japanese had the most experienced, battle-hardened aviators in the world. It was a mismatch that horrified every planner in Pearl Harbor. The situation was grim, bordering on suicidal. Then came a crucial signal from the South Pacific. Following the brutal, indecisive Battle of Coral Sea just weeks earlier, the USS Lexington was sunk and the USS Yorktown was savagely damaged. The Japanese intelligence, always prone to overconfidence, had prematurely reported the Yorktown sunk. American admirals, knowing they could not win without a third carrier, decided to exploit this massive deception. The crippled Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942. Navy Yard officials estimated the repairs required to make her fully seaworthy would take 90 days. Nimitz's response was a legendary moment of wartime urgency. He told his staff in no uncertain terms that they had 72 hours. What followed was an extraordinary, frantic ballet of American industrial power. Hundreds of workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, welders, pipe fitters, electricians, carpenters, swarmed the damaged carrier. The repairs were not cosmetic, they were fundamental. Steel plating was patched, wiring replaced, and major structural damage to the carrier's port side was hastily mitigated. Men worked continuously, powered by coffee, sheer desperation, and patriotism. The workers knew they were fighting not just the clock, but the entire weight of the Japanese offensive. The goal wasn't a perfect repair, merely a functional one, to get the flight deck level and the engines running. In an unprecedented feat of wartime logistics, the Yorktown left the dry dock in just those 72 hours, leaving the civilian yard workers to continue major hull work while she was already underway. She took aboard a mismatched collection of replacement aircraft, and green pilots hastily pulled from shore duty and headed north to the rendezvous point. The American fleet, now 3 carriers strong, though one was a fragile ghost ship, had just enough strength to stand a chance. Meanwhile, Midway Atoll itself, the geographical prize and bait for the entire Japanese operation, was being transformed into a small, defiant fortress. The handful of Marines and Navy personnel under the command of Captain Cyril Simard knew that they were the diversion, the tripwire that had to absorb the first inevitable hammer blow. Their defense was improvised and desperate. Every available aircraft, regardless of age or fitness, was pressed into service. Obsolescent Vought Vindicators and Brewster Buffaloes, aircraft already far outclassed by the Japanese Zero, were positioned for a hopeless defensive aerial battle. On the ground, every machine gun, every anti-aircraft gun, and every foot of barbed wire was positioned and double-checked. They knew the Japanese would try to neutralize the island's air power before the carriers arrived. The American strategy, designed by Nimitz and refined by the task force commanders, Admirals Spruance and Fletcher, was a daring reversal of traditional naval engagement. Instead of being positioned defensively near Midway, the three American carrier task forces, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, would wait 300 miles northeast of the atoll. This positioning was key, based entirely on Rochefort's intelligence. It was far enough away to avoid detection by Japanese scout planes, yet close enough to strike with devastating speed once the Japanese carriers were distracted by the initial Midway defense. The Americans were not planning a defensive engagement. They were planning an ambush. On the eve of battle, the tension was palpable. The American sailors knew the Japanese were coming in overwhelming force. They knew their enemy's track record of victory. But they sailed into the vast, lonely ocean with one critical war-winning advantage. They knew where the Japanese were. The Japanese had no idea where they were. The stage was set for the critical moment where intelligence met destiny.
At 4:30 a.m. on the morning of June 4, 1942, the Japanese Carrier Strike Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, began the first phase of its meticulously planned attack. 40 miles from Midway, 108 aircraft roared off the decks of the four great carriers and headed for the atoll. The plan was textbook: neutralize the island's air defenses and runways first, then prepare for the American fleet. However, the element of surprise, the cornerstone of the Midway plan, was already gone. Hours earlier, an American scout plane had spotted the advancing Japanese armada. The message was relayed to Admiral Spruance: enemy carriers sighted. The ambush was now primed. As the Japanese strike force hit Midway, the island's meager defenses performed their duty as the tripwire. The outgunned Marines fought with furious desperation, losing most of their aircraft but successfully slowing the Japanese attackers and inflicting enough damage to the first wave that its commanders signaled Admiral Nagumo a second strike would be necessary to truly neutralize the base. This request initiated the fatal series of decisions that would cost Japan the battle. Nagumo, a superb tactical commander but a rigid thinker, now faced a dilemma. His hangar decks were full of the returning, damaged first strike aircraft, and his ready aircraft were armed with land bombs for the secondary attack on Midway. But the sighting of the American fleet meant he needed to quickly rearm them with the armor-piercing torpedoes and bombs necessary to sink American warships. The vast hangar decks of the Akagi and Kaga descended into a vortex of chaos. Fuel lines were run, torpedoes were wrestled out of storage, and heavy land bombs were unceremoniously stacked along the walls, waiting to be replaced by high-explosive anti-ship ordnance. This was a violation of every safety rule, and in the frantic rush, armed ordnance and full fuel lines turned the Japanese carriers into floating powder kegs. Nagumo made the fateful decision: wait for the second strike to land, bring the aircraft below deck, and complete the rearming process. He gambled precious minutes against American distance. Meanwhile, the Americans launched their attack with cold, surgical efficiency. Admiral Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, launched his aircraft immediately, prioritizing speed over coordination. He ordered a maximal effort, knowing that hitting the Japanese fleet while they were in this state of disarray, the vulnerable moment, was their only path to victory. But the uncoordinated launch led to disaster. As the American dive bombers and torpedo planes crossed the vast Pacific expanse, the squadrons became separated. The faster, higher-flying dive bombers could not find the Japanese fleet and continued searching. The slower, low-flying torpedo squadrons arrived first. The first to reach the target was Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8 from the Hornet. Led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, they bravely approached the Japanese carriers without any fighter escort, a critical error by their dive bomber partners. They were immediately spotted. The Japanese Zero fighters, the finest naval fighter aircraft in the world, swarmed the lumbering, slow-moving American TBD Devastator torpedo planes. The battle was a massacre. VT-8 flew straight and level through a hail of fire, attempting to drop their torpedoes, but their aircraft were obsolete and their torpedoes often ineffective. The sacrifice was absolute. 15 aircraft flew into the fight. Only one pilot survived. Yet this sacrificial attack was not in vain. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, CAP, the Zero fighters charged with protecting the carriers, were forced to descend to low altitude to deal with the slow torpedo bombers. Their focus was dragged down to the deck, where the threat was immediate and low. Moments later, the remaining American torpedo squadrons, VT-3 from Yorktown and VT-6 from Enterprise, arrived and were met with the same withering defense. These attacks, too, were devastated. But their sacrifice compounded the critical error of the Japanese CAP. The Zero fighters, exhausted and dangerously low on fuel, were still skimming the waves, chasing the ghost of the torpedo planes. The decks of the Japanese carriers remained chaotic, aircraft engines revving for launch, fuel lines snaking across the decks, and stacks of bombs waiting to be secured. Nagumo's flagship, Akagi, was minutes away from launching its newly armed strike wave. The crucial 30 minutes Nagumo had gambled on were nearly up. Suddenly, an alarm screamed through the decks of the carriers, a sound unlike the low-level alarms they had been fighting all morning. The Japanese fighter pilots, fixated on the waves, had failed to spot the true threat now arriving from the clear, blue, sunlit sky above. The final, fatal opening had been created by the heroic sacrifice of the doomed American torpedo squadrons. The hammer was about to fall.
The stage was set by sacrifice and chance. The American torpedo planes had been shot down, but their death throes had sucked the entire Japanese fighter defense down to the wave tops, leaving the skies above dangerously empty. Vice Admiral Nagumo, minutes away from launching his devastating counterstrike, had just won the low-level fight, but he had utterly lost the war above. High above the clouds, flying in two separate disorganized groups, were the American dive bombers, the Douglas SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise in Yorktown. They had become separated from their escorts and were dangerously low on fuel after hours of searching the empty Pacific. They were on the brink of having to ditch or return home empty-handed. It was in this desperate moment that Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's air group, made one of the most crucial command decisions of the entire war. He followed his intuition. Not seeing the Japanese fleet in its expected location, he extended his search pattern far past the point of safety, following the wake of a single Japanese destroyer that was steaming away from the action. McCluskey's gut feeling paid off. At 10:22 a.m., exhausted and running on fumes, he sighted the Japanese fleet. The sight was overwhelming. 4 magnificent carriers steaming in a diamond formation, their decks chaotic but nearly ready to launch. At precisely the same time, another group of dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie from the Yorktown, arrived from a different angle. The attack was uncoordinated but perfectly timed. As the air groups dove, the Japanese lookouts screamed warnings, but it was too late. The Zeros, scrambling from low altitude, could not climb fast enough to stop the attack. The Dauntlesses, plunging down at near vertical angles, were terrifyingly accurate. The focus of the first group was the Kaga and the Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. On the deck of the Akagi, the fuel lines were still running, and the hangars below were crammed with armed and fueled aircraft. The first bomb ignited the fuel lines and the stacks of ordnance with catastrophic efficiency. The massive carrier was instantly transformed into a raging pyre. Within 4 minutes, the precise duration that decided the Pacific War, 3 of the 4 heavy Japanese carriers were mortally hit. The Kaga was hit repeatedly and burst into flames as aviation fuel and exposed bombs erupted. The Soryu was struck 3 times, tearing through the deck and starting an uncontrollable inferno in the hangar. The explosions were not just external, they were internal,
turning the carrier's own offensive power against them. The heat was so intense that the Japanese crew could not approach the fires, and the ships were rendered steaming, blazing wrecks. One pilot, Lieutenant Richard Best, distinguished himself with an act of almost unbelievable precision and bravery. Diving alone after his group split, Best scored a direct hit on the Akagi, sinking Nagumo's flagship. His single, decisive act was later credited with securing the fate of the carrier. Incredibly, Best then ascended and joined the attack on the last remaining carrier, the Hiryu. On that second attack, he scored a direct hit on the Hiryu as well, the only pilot in history to score hits on 2 enemy carriers in a single day. Admiral Nagumo, seeing the utter destruction of his command, was forced to abandon the Akagi, his tactical control shattered. The swift, brutal, and coordinated air attack had achieved the impossible. But the battle was not over. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack against the American fleet. The Hiryu's planes tracked down the American Yorktown, the ship that was supposed to be at the bottom of the ocean. In a stunning display of Japanese naval skill, 2 concentrated attacks struck the Yorktown, crippling the fragile, hastily repaired carrier and forcing its crew to abandon ship. The price of the American intelligence and engineering miracle was paid in full. However, the Japanese success was temporary. Enterprise's dive bombers soon located the last remaining carrier, the Hiryu, and within hours, she too was reduced to a flaming wreck. By the evening of June 4, 1942, the decisive phase of the Pacific War had concluded. Yamamoto ordered the rest of the Japanese fleet to retreat. The cost was astronomical: 4 fleet carriers and the loss of nearly 3,500 highly trained sailors, and critically, hundreds of the finest, most experienced naval aviators in the world. The Americans had won the battle, not just by sinking ships, but by destroying Japan's operational core. The era of Japanese expansion was over. The era of American dominance had begun.
By the evening of June 4, 1942, the decisive action of the Battle of Midway was concluded. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving the devastating reports, 4 carriers ablaze, 3 sunk, the 4th doomed, issued the bitter order to withdraw. The sheer shock of the disaster was immense, yet the Japanese command tried desperately to manage the narrative. The losses were initially concealed, even from the pilots and sailors who had witnessed the destruction firsthand. The myth of Japanese invincibility had to be preserved. But the facts were unforgiving, and they brought the Japanese Admiralty face to face with a terrifying new reality. They had lost 4 of their 6 irreplaceable fleet carriers, the nucleus of the Kido Butai. The sinking of the ships was only half the catastrophe. The greater strategic loss was the annihilation of the human capital aboard them. Japanese naval aviation relied on a small pool of highly trained, veteran pilots and mechanics, men who had dominated the skies since 1937. At Midway, they lost over 200 of their most experienced aviators. These men could not be replaced. Training new pilots took years, and Japan's centralized training pipeline could not compete with the sheer volume of the American system, which was now churning out new, well-equipped aviators every month. This is the ultimate answer to the question: why did the Japanese admirals stop underestimating American sailors after Midway? It was not merely that the Americans fought harder. It was that the Americans demonstrated an overwhelming superiority in 3 critical, non-combat fields. Superior intelligence. The code-breaking genius of Rochefort meant the entire plan was compromised before a single plane left the deck. Japanese communication security had failed them utterly. Superior logistics and damage control. The 72-hour repair of the USS Yorktown was a logistical miracle that defied Japanese military intelligence and provided the critical 3rd carrier needed to balance the odds.
While the Yorktown eventually succumbed, her sacrifice bought the time needed to sink the Japanese fleet. American industry and engineering proved faster and more resilient than Japanese pride. Superior adaptability and training. The Americans, though often suffering terrible casualties, used every engagement as a learning tool. They quickly adopted tactical innovations like the thatch weave, which would soon neutralize the Zero's advantage, and prioritized pilot survival and data feedback. In contrast, Japanese military doctrine was rigid and prioritized zealous offensive spirit over tactical adaptation, leading to the continued reliance on obsolete aircraft and ineffective torpedoes. The strategic consequences were immediate and irreversible. Before Midway, the Pacific War was characterized by Japanese expansion. After Midway, it was characterized by Japanese defense and retreat. The battle restored the balance of power, leveling the carrier count and giving the Allies the initiative. Midway directly led to the Battle of Guadalcanal just 2 months later. With the carrier balance shifted, the U.S. felt confident enough to launch its first major offensive in the Pacific. The fierce, brutal 6-month fight for that small island saw Japan expend irreplaceable resources and more veterans, pushing them permanently on the defensive. The fatal delusion, the belief that America was too weak or too materialistic to sustain a long attritional war, was shattered. Japanese admirals now understood they were not fighting a single-strike conflict. They were fighting the full, relentless fury of the American industrial power, an engine capable of replacing sunken ships and lost planes faster than Japan could ever produce them. Midway, born of intelligence and won by sacrifice, was the undeniable turning point. It exposed the fatal structural weaknesses of the Japanese war machine and demonstrated that American sailors, far from being soft, possessed the skill, the technology, and the industrial backing to conquer the Pacific. The prophecy of Admiral Yamamoto had come true. The 6 months of running wild were over. The long, brutal reckoning had just begun.